So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martens. I'm the head of digital citizenship at European Schoolnet, which is a network of ministries of education, but people in this room are most likely to know us from the work we do on behalf of the Commission in terms of implementing the Better Internet for Kids initiative. So if you want to know more about that, you can go to betternetforkids.eu. And I was very pleased to be invited by Lane and the team to chair this session, where we'll focus on a fresh approach to measuring digital skills. And I can honestly say that digital skills, digital literacy, it's really at the core of what we do every day from a policy-oriented, from a practical point of view. And often we worry because we often lack a bit of the evidence and the data to inform our work, and we also don't really know how to measure, how to monitor the things we try to do. So it's really nice that today we are here with a panel, and we will zoom in specifically on the fresh approach that the ySKILLS project has adopted in measuring digital skills, and we will talk in particular about the Youth Digital Skills Indicator, and to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of what we are referring to. And I think expectations have been built up in the morning because there were several references to Alan's presentation, but we will start with Alan, who will give a 15-minute introduction in terms of what this YDSI is exactly about, and also the path towards getting there. And then afterwards, Alan will be joined by the other panelists, which are Alexander van Deursen from the University of Twente, Kimmo Alho from University of Helsinki, and Natalia Waechter from the University of Graz. But we will start with Alan, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So yeah, I have heard that there's been quite a lot of anticipation of all the things that I'm going to include in 15 minutes. I will try to give an overview, but obviously, if we can have the slides up, that would be good. Then there we go. So I was going to talk about the Youth Digital Skills Index, or the YDSI. I will also refer mostly to its development and also a little bit to how it's linked to some of the performance tests that we have also developed as part of it. But obviously, because 15 minutes is not enough, there are several reports that are associated with this. So I really do encourage you to go and look at that, especially because, you know, the richness or the kind of real importance is in the detail of how we have come to develop some of these indexes. And what I will be presenting now is kind of the end result of that. And I'll try to give you a slight idea of kind of how. But please do read the reports. I think it's really important to recognize that the work that we have done is based on kind of decades of work that has gone on before, that is also going on at the moment, including in Europe and in other parts of the world. So the work that we did was inspired by projects like the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, who really sees skills as kind of one of the things that helps us achieve or perhaps, as we've heard in some of the previous presentations, kind of limits well-being, so it's part of a broader process. But also projects like the DigComp is very important. In fact, we've had many collaborations in talking about the measures that they've developed based on what we did. The PISA studies, so there's a lot of material out there. And one of the things that I want to do is kind of reflect a little bit on how the approach that we are taking is a fresh approach in light of what has already been done. It does build on that previous work, but it's also a kind of important fine-tuning or adjustments, kind of additions to the work that's been gone on before. So one of the things that the ySKILLS digital literacy is how we're kind of framing it at the moment, kind of model does, the conceptual model, is that it's this integrated framework that kind of goes a little bit beyond the kind of technical or operational skills and the kind of ability to navigate the web and looking for information, which has been central to the development of an idea of what literacy and skills actually are, to integrating more a digital world that's interactive, right? The kinds of skills that you need not just to use content that's out there, but also to create content, to interact with others. And we've seen in the presentations this morning that these are actually often very fundamental in creating positive engagement with that. So important here is that it's not just functional skills, these functional skills that allow you to use the technologies in the way perhaps intended or designed, but that it's also a critical knowledge in terms of understanding why technologies are the way they are, or what impact they might have on ourselves and others. This means that literacy in and of itself is not just skills in terms of what you can do, but also what you know. Yeah, and that is one of the important contributions, I think, of the measures, but also of the conceptualization that we've developed to make sure that, because sometimes people have a lot of knowledge, but they don't have the skills to be able to kind of for that knowledge to materialize in more positive engagement. And sometimes people have the skills, but not the understanding of how the world is constructed in that sense. So they are only able to use technologies in ways that might not be kind of creative or kind of step outside the box, or are in ways that actually might change the world in a more positive way. One of the other important things, and that's what we describe in the theoretical report that also David Schmahel discussed also this morning, is that we do make a distinction here between skills, or literacy in this case, which is that combination of skills and knowledge, and things like self-efficacy, which is really the confidence that people have in and of themselves, which often comes from many other factors rather than just their ability to engage with technologies or their knowledge of technologies. It's important to be able to engage, but it's not, doesn't tell us what we need to know. Same thing with attitudes towards technologies. And the same thing as we distinguish it also from what you actually do. Because self-efficacy, attitudes, and use, while are important in determining this kind of fruitful engagement, they do not really allow us to draw conclusions around which types of kind of specific literacies we need to be able to achieve well-being, to translate this use into a positive experience for ourselves and others. One of the things, and I'll talk about the measurement in a sec, because that was the kind of really main purpose of this talk, is that that this conceptual model, it was designed also to be robust for different people living in different circumstances. So it's a general model, right? It's a model that should be able to be applied across society. We've tested actually some of these models and the measurements that I will be presenting later on more adult populations, where it also works. It also designed to be robust for if technologies change. We know the digital world changes a lot. And so this conceptual model is also meant to say, like, even if we are trying to kind of think of a different digital world, then these kind of general domains of digital skills are still going to be there. What goes in these domains, in terms, and that's where I go to the measurement, might be slightly different depending on the technology or the circumstance that we're talking about, but the kind of theorization should be robust in a digital future. I'm going to talk about measurement next. So in the reports we describe different types of measurement, indirect measurements, which are measuring use and engagement. And this is one of the common problems that we actually see in skills measurements, is that they measure outcomes. So the outcome of a process of using technology, in the case like, have you seen fake news? And if they haven't, then supposedly they are skilled. Or are you able to prevent getting bullied? And then supposedly they are skilled. But we don't actually know what is it that allows them to prevent being bullied, right? Which is the literacies that we're talking about. Then, you know, they are about use in the sense of designing a website or installing a virus, but we don't really know what the kind of skills are necessarily or that are there. So often these measures, they measure things like use and outcomes rather than actual skills. The most common way of measuring this is through surveys, which are obviously self-assessment measures, and ySKILLS also uses surveys as a tool. But often what people do when they do this kind of self-assessment is they measure actual confidence, because they ask questions like, you know, how good are you at? something, which we know is more related to how confident the person is and what their position of power is, or kind of how privileged they are. People who tend to be more privileged tend to think that they are better at things than they actually are, right? So, and we can kind of draw conclusions about which groups or which types of people there are. So these kinds of measures often suffer from this kind of social desirability, trying to be better, pretend to be better than you are. And there's a lot of problems with those kinds of measures. Some people think that the gold standard is the performance tests or observations, because we can actually see that somebody's able to do something. But the problem is that those have to be very specific, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in the panel about strengths and weaknesses of the performance tests. So what we have done in ySKILLS is actually self-assessment through surveys, but validated through an extensive process of interviews, on really understanding how people look at these kinds of assessments and validating them through performance tests to see if there's an actual correlation between what people say in the self-assessment and what people do in tasks, and how it's related to factors that we know impact that. So I'm going to talk about the practice guidelines that we have developed for the measurement of these kinds of skills in surveys, and this is based both on a review of the literature, but also on the research that we've done. So one of the things that our measures do is they avoid device or app or activity-specific type items, because we want, as I said before, for our surveys or kind of our items to be valid, even if somebody doesn't have an experience with a particular app, or apps change, there's trends. If Twitter doesn't exist anymore, X doesn't exist anymore, we still want to be able to measure some of these skills. The other thing is that, as I already kind of talked about before, that it really has to be about skills rather than about use, because if somebody does something, doesn't mean that they're necessarily good at doing that. The other thing is it's about, in terms of how we ask the question, we don't want to measure confidence, we want to measure skills, so it's really about asking, do you know very specifically how to do a specific action, a kind of a tangible action, or have a tangible kind of knowledge, rather than how expert they are, because expertise tends to be subject to confidence. The other thing that we noticed when we were doing the validations through these interviews with lots of young people across the countries that were part of ySKILLS is that if we ask just, do you know how to, psychologically, people start saying like, well, in comparison with this person, I actually really know how to do this. I'm pretty sure, but in comparison with the other person, I don't. So it depends a lot on the reference framework that people have when they answer these questions. So I will show you how we formulated the question to avoid this kind of comparison. But what we want to know is the person able to do that on their own right now? So there was a kind of a development of these measures there, taking into consideration that people live in different contexts. So the other important point here is that a lot of people focus on the formulation of the actual items around skills, and that's really important, what we actually measure in terms of items, but actually our research in this project and in other projects has shown over and over again that what really makes the difference for the validity and the reliability of these kinds of instruments is actually the answer scale that is used, and that different answer scales can have very different properties, especially in terms of social desirability bias or confirmation biases. And there, in this scale, it's very important to kind of include a lot of options for people to say that they don't have a skill, because otherwise you get people just wanting to appear, good in front of the interviewer that they imagine is, if it's an online survey or a physical survey. So I've already talked about the need to distinguish skills and knowledge, and that was mentioned in the morning. One of the important things is that because people tend to want to, say that things are true, that's a kind of inherent psychological principle that human beings have, is that when we design these kinds of skills, which I'm going to show you next, is that it's important that there are enough similar statements that can be true and that can be untrue, so that people really have to think about that and not feel like they want to be nice by claiming that things are true, either to themselves or to others. So this is the way that we have designed, and I'm going to show this to you again. Please read the report. But what's important about the scale is that we have developed is this kind of that it needs to be based on truth claims about yourself. So it kind of implies you have to be honest, right, about this. And if you had to do it now and on your own. So really important in this skill is actually that option. I do not understand what you mean by this, because it gives people the option to say, I have no clue what you're talking about. Yeah? Even if in our analysis, as you will have seen in the morning, we often only use the difference between people who have high levels of these skills versus the rest, but you can only achieve a good distribution in these kinds of measures if you actually measure it on a scale. So that's a little bit technical there. This, I know, is going to be unreadable, so because the letters, we can read it on the small screen here, but you could probably not read it on the screen in the back. But these are the items of the final skill, and again, more detail is given in the report. I wanted to highlight just one thing about the process is that we validated these through cognitive interviews, where we looked at, whether what we were thinking we were measuring was actually being measured. But we also did statistical validation and reliability testing across different countries to see if the skills that we developed had the same properties. Yeah, not if people had the same answers, but if they had the same properties. And so that's how we got to the final list of items. One of the interesting things was, and that's the second thing I wanted to highlight, is that programming, even though we initially had thought it's often put in this kind of technical operational skill, depended on the country, whether it was a technical skill or more a content creation skill or actually more something to do with a kind of creative skill. So it was kind of interestingly positioned, and as we've seen in the presentation this morning, it had different characteristics. So in the end, we decided to include it as a separate measure because of these properties, and future research will have to unpack what's actually going on with programming and why it's so different. These are the kind of critical knowledge items where, you can see we have information, communication and interaction, content creation and production, and we don't, as you might notice, have a technical operational one, because basically every first item on this list is a technical operational element within that other domain. So, and again, if you want to know how to use these skills, please go to the report. There's very detailed information on that. I'm going to just close off this kind of presentation by just mentioning the performance tests and a little bit on why we also developed the performance test was, first of all, to validate the kind of skills that we developed, but also because they have a different function. So the performance test, which I think we'll get at once we have the panel discussion, had these broad categories of tasks. And indeed, we showed that there was a correlation that people who indicated having higher skills in our tests, in our yDSI measures, also performed better on performance tests. But there was quite a lot of difference in that between different countries, between different groups. And that is because performance tests are much more sensitive to context, while the measures that we do in a survey are, because of the way they were designed, kind of more, they measure general skills, general domains, so it's a good general indicator of where people lie in these different dimensions. While performance tests have to be much more adapted to specific circumstances. So let me get to the conclusions. Is that skills measurement is difficult, yeah? And so there can be holes poked into everything that we do. Yeah, none of these is going to be perfect. Often what we see is that skills measurement is narrow in scope, focusing on this kind of instrumental and not the interactive, creative parts. Very much on functional, what can you do, not really how does what you know impact your ability to engage with these environments. I think the important thing about the kind of the last 3 points here is that there are theoretically and methodological ways of avoiding some of the critiques. Again, they're not going to be perfect, that have of self-report measures, which is kind of the only instrument we have to really do this kind of measurement in large-scale population data. Obviously, they need to be adapted in slightly changing futures. Please don't touch the answer scales, because those have been developed painstakingly. But, some of these items might be changed or adapted or replaced in terms of the wording because they have the same kind of general meaning, even if they're referring to different specific types of skills or platforms in different contexts. So I realize that this is not enough And I'm sure we have time over lunch, and we'll have a panel discussion around all the implications of this. But yeah, I'm hoping that it gave a good overview of the reasoning behind and the development of the skills.
Okay, thank you very much. So now the idea really is to build upon some of the things you've said, and I think making that connection between the survey items, but then also the digital skills performance test. I think that's also something which is quite unique within the ySKILLS project, and also for me more from a policy practical point of view. If you look at these tests and how they are being carried out, it makes me quite excited because it brings you so close to then the real life experience and what you could expect from children and young people. So I think it's useful for Alexander to talk a bit more about the development process, but then perhaps also the strengths, weaknesses, and ways forward for these kind of performance tests.
Yeah, thank you. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Yeah, so as Alan said, performance testing is a really valid way to measure digital skills because participants are basically given the opportunity to actually demonstrate their skills. And typically what we see is that performance tasks are built of authentic tasks that require participants to actually perform tasks online. And with authentic here, I mean that these tasks evolve around the interests and also are appropriate for the target group, in this case, the children. So the main benefit of performance tests is that they provide a, well, I think we'd say an absolute skill measure and are therefore more valid than, for example, self-assessments or indirect measures of digital skills. Now for the tasks and for the tests, we used, of course, the ySKILLS conceptual framework. Alan also already showed that we have three types of skills that we focused on in the performance tests. So it's information, navigation and processing, communication and interaction, and content creation and production. And for example, we developed tasks in which children were asked to find information on climate change. They were asked to assess the trustworthiness of several websites, to identify the intention of several social media posts that, for example, contained advertisements, fake news, or phishing. We asked them to deal with all kinds of nasty comments in chat conversations, and we also asked them to create, for example, a presentation with slides that had to adhere to all kinds of criteria. Now, the performance on all these tasks provide very detailed information on why a certain skill level is at the level it is. So there is much more detail in the results than, for example, survey questions can provide. So that's, of course, the main benefit. There are also drawbacks to performance testing. For example, the labor intensity and time consumingness. Not sure whether that's a word. It's very labor intensive in terms of development, in terms of execution, and also in terms of evaluation. And I'm really sure that the partners who were involved in doing the performance tests in the 6 countries know exactly what I'm talking about. So big thanks to these partners here. There were several issues and lessons that we learned in the development and execution of these performance tests. We have a very detailed report, especially on the lessons that we learned. Well, there was too many details to go into now, but for example, when we started the development of the performance test, we expected that the tasks for information skills would be the easiest to develop. However, they proved to be really difficult simply because the information provision is very different between countries and between languages. So these kind of, well, things that we did not envision popped up. But this is all in the report. So if you're going to develop performance tests yourselves, make sure that you take a look at the key lessons in this report. We also have a second report, which specifically focuses on the results of the performance tests. We compared 6 countries in there. And, well, the main result is that there was a lot of room for improvement. The results question whether children are actually able to benefit from online information provision, and whether they know what's courteous and appropriate online behavior, or know how to create a slide with these different criteria. So, yeah, a lot of detailed results also in that report, and both reports are available on the ySKILLS website.
Very much. So, and now we try to turn the panel into a bit of an exchange. So the follow-up question for Natalia and Kimmo, and also for people in the room. So towards the end, we would like to get some questions from the audience as well. But the question is first also to Natalia, maybe to reflect and to give a bit of your perspective in terms of what you have learned in terms of digital skills measurement, being part of this project and also throughout the process. And maybe also bring us a bit looking forward, like what do you see as interesting areas of work within this context, bringing digital skills measurement forward?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have learned a lot throughout this project, as we probably all have, also regarding measuring digital skills. And I maybe start with the survey measurement of digital skills, where Ellen mentioned that it was a long process of developing it, and we kind of had, I think I would call it like a bottom-up approach, that we really put a lot of effort also when developing the questionnaire to talk with young people. You said we did cognitive interviews. A lot of you probably know what that is, but maybe I can also explain it a little bit. So we really, in each country, in each language, we did interviews with young people in this age group, and going through the draft questionnaire and asking them for each item, for each question, what they think about it, how they understand what we ask, and what are their thoughts about it. So we really put a lot of effort into creating something that the young people, like creating a questionnaire that really fits to our target group, and that we have questions that they can relate with. So I think this is one of the many of the strengths of the questionnaire. And related to the, and one of the, about the next steps, as Ellen has explained, there is the critical knowledge side, and then there's the functional skill side, and that's also how we presented some results this morning. And one of the next steps will be to combine them more, to see if they really measure kind of the same thing. If we take for example, for information skills and knowledge, if we combine the critical and the functional aspects into one indicator of information. So, but this is something for the future to find out if we can, come up here with very new, unique results. And about the performance tests, I think even though it's probably, because it's very new and it's a great instrument, and not only for research, it's also a great tool for educators to be used in schools, for digital education, for digital media education. So it's and it was great being part of it, developing that tool, and something new and unique also targeted at the target group of young people. And even though it might not be so helpful for validating the survey, because it's just, as Alexandra has also explained, it's like a much smaller sample. You cannot, you cannot compare that well the two kind of data sets. But I think we still learn a lot from it, and it's going to be very helpful. And one of the next steps will be to or could be for the future research to have like larger samples and to have more standardized coding maybe, because we had, I think the coding process alone would be like a whole a new big research task. And but as I said, both really, really helpful and unique.
I would, to that last comment, I would say welcome to the world of teachers who have to code answers to these kind of tests on a daily basis. But let's go to Kimmo first, and like for you the same question, and I think you also bring a bit of a specific perspective based on how you were involved in the ySKILLS project, so you can explain that part perhaps as well.
Yes, I think Natalia already said a lot of important things about. Yes, of course, I'm watching development of these tests. Like an outsider, but we use them in our functional MRI neuroimaging studies as a background variables, and also here at Leuven, Bert de Smeed and his group did some research that I might mention later. So first of all, I think this has been highly important work, and I like to measure things. I'm an experimental psychologist and neuroscientist, and I think that the fact that what we have seen this morning and overall in the ySKILLS project is that these measures work because we get results, and I want to see results, you know, and I think that the work done here is extremely important in that sense, since there is so much mis and disinformation about digital technology and its effects on young people or older people. Which brings to my mind what I started thinking when I went through your reports: how well do we adults? What would be our scores? I mean, thinking of successful internet scams, hate speech in internet, and would my all colleagues they don't pass on the first round the university internet security test. They have to take it twice or thrice. So we are not that good, really. I mean, what should we expect from from younger people? But of course, they are digital natives, and we are not. This coming to that performance test, that's an. Yes, the interesting finding was that Bert de Smeed and colleagues here at Leuven, they did in a small sample of Belgian 12 to 13-year-olds the performance test, and they also measured their attention and working memory skills with just experimental psychology procedures. In-back task for the working memory, if you're aware of that, and the flanker test for the attention. And they found a high correlation between performance test scores and attention and working memory skills over 0.5, which is, I think, tremendous. I mean, you don't normally see that, and their sample was small. It was 19 participants. And I started thinking that, what about real school life? Is this, I mean, of course, working memory and attention skills correlate with a lot of things at school, for example, math performance and these kind of things. But now when they are tested in performance test here in ySKILLS, they know that they are under like control, and they have certain time pressure anyway. So what about real school life? I mean, could we measure, and this is something to future, could we measure really in classrooms with various tasks? I think these tasks were really wonderful. I mean, but what happens if there wouldn't be time pressure and not so much adult control of the performance? And yeah, that's one thing that I thought. Let me see now. I have notes here on my smart. This is not so smart phone, or the user is not so. Oh, just a final thing that another thing that as an kind of what interests me, and we kind of don't talk about it, was the difference between countries. Of course, these were not random samples, and they don't allow comparisons. And I think it's good that they were not reported. But you can still see from the data that there are differences. I was wondering, is that how much, for example, when adolescents are self-assessing, how much the cultural background affects that? Is there more self-confidence, let's say in Finland, where I come from? But then they were not, Finnish kids, they're not performing that well, but they really think that they are good. Well, I can see that in my own family. There's a lot of self-confidence about digital technology use. And that would be an interesting question to study further with bigger and randomized samples. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think so. We will build upon that. So I think what we're also trying to do with the panel, and I thank you all for moving into that direction. We start with something which is fairly dry methodological, but we try to bring it to what do we learn from it from a theoretical point of view, but also start looking into policy, practical implications. So I think you mentioned the country comparisons as an example. So in terms of what are we learning from this, but you also mentioned some concrete applications in education practice. So I think Ellen is very keen to respond.
I wanted to follow up because I think this last point is actually really important in terms of understanding also the difference between kind of the idea behind the survey measures and the performance tests. Because the performance tests by their very nature are embedded in a specific context. I think also, and you know, Alexander obviously can say much more about that because he's been in charge of kind of also coordinating this. But like the context in which people do the performance tests, from the kind of devices that they use or the teacher that's there to support them, and then it's actually kind of has an impact in that sense. And I think your point is extremely interesting, that one of the things that performance tasks actually might also be measuring is your ability to concentrate on a task and complete a task, which whether it was digital or not digital, whether you have high levels of skills or not, might actually be a very important indicator. And so what in the survey, because of the nature of survey research, when you try to design these kinds of measures, coming back to a more dry methodological point, is we always talk about the independent effect that these have. So we need to make sure that when we measure skills, it's not self-confidence, that we can measure that in parallel. You know, what does it do if you have high levels of self-confidence and high skills? And this morning, there was already a few presentations around that. But one of the things that we haven't done, and that might be really interesting to do in future research, is to actually see, because Alexander and his colleagues have done a lot of work in this, how these kinds of skill actually are intermingled and enmeshed with other, what you have called 21st century skills, I think, right? Because it's about the interaction of skills with other things. And the nature of survey research is that we want to have a measure that's separate and that measures something unique. But obviously we are not saying that these skills are kind of isolated and that just getting these skills is going to allow people to translate their engagement in digital environment into kind of this positive outcomes of that use. So I think that is really important, because especially in classrooms, there's a lot of pressures. Of various kinds. They might be performance, school-based, but it's also peer pressure, right? How are you doing? Are you answering questions about bullying in a task when you know that the person who's sitting in that same room actually has maybe been bullying you or bullying someone else? So the imaginations that we have with these kinds of practical tasks. And I wanted to come back then, before handing over to other people, to one of the things that Natalia said about these things, that these tools can really be used also not just to measure in kind of a way, static way, what levels of skill do we have, but as conversation starters, right? And I think the research that was presented this morning, the more qualitative aspects, it's really important for people to then go, also as adults, to do these things and actually now thinking about it, I don't really know how, or what are your experiences when you say that you have or this skill or not, right? So these are very important tools to also create awareness and to have conversations and to engage with a more nuanced debate than what is going on in some sectors of society right now around, you know, the digital world. I think that is, if you were asking about where can we take this next, they are not just standalone things, but they should be part, in my opinion, of a wider conversation.
Just two small comments on that. I don't want to go into much detail on this, but besides being a very valid measurement tool, these performance tests, what we also noticed in several countries, serve as a very nice tool for the teachers to engage with their students, to talk about the results, to learn from each other. It's also incorporated, for example, in the ySKILLS toolkit a bit, so that's also a function, of course. And you asked about comparisons with adults. We actually did it in the Netherlands, and we are very similar to adolescents. So also a lot of room for improvement there.
I want to add something on the question of country comparison, and we cannot really compare countries because we don't have representative samples. But considering we don't have representative samples, it's even more striking that we observe the same trends in our regional samples in 6 countries. For example, what I showed in the morning, how the 4 categories of digital skills, you know, information and communication, differ, how the skills differ, and that's in all 6 countries. It's the same, that the young people have deficits in information skills, whereas they're really good in communication and interaction skills. So this shows us first that our sample isn't bad, and second, that there is general trends in Europe for young people.
I would like to take this opportunity to see if there are any questions coming from the audience, and I'm sure there will be at least one. And if not, I have another question, and there's also, I have them already. So, okay, good. So I'll have a question first, and then we go to the Zoom question as well. So I think we covered the methodological aspects. We talked a bit about theoretical findings. We moved it into the practical realm, but I like maybe we're still missing a bit the policy part. And I actually have two questions within that context, and one is coming from what's coming out of the Zoom questions as well. So first of all, policymakers use existing statistics, and they often refer to these as measurements of digital skills. But reading your reports, I think you would typically characterize them as not being entirely adequate. I'm being diplomatic. So my question would also be in terms of guidance for the policymakers. What do you think they should do? So is it good that they are trying to use these data, or should they completely change their approach? And then the follow-up question, and that's also linked to one of the online questions we had, also based on what you have learned from the project and these more specific measurements of digital skills. Do you have any guidance in terms of the kind of action which is needed? Like, what are the areas where we need to prove, and how can we involve policymakers in that debate so that they push for the right priorities? And I'll just maybe take everyone's take on it. So maybe Alexander, you can start, and I'll give away my microphone, and I know that's a very risky thing to do if you're moderating. Okay.
Yes, two comments here. Indeed, there are several benchmarks which have severe limitations because they use self-assessments or very often also indirect measures. So the short advice would be start using the DSI. That would be really great. And I know Ellen is talking to a lot of policy makers and benchmark developers, and also trying to get them involved here. And the second remark is that if we, what I also should start thinking about is that we now talk a lot about internet skills, but we are evolving to a sort of mediated reality in which we are surrounded by all kinds of platforms, devices, etc., etc. So it's not that much anymore about internet. It's the whole reality that should be taken into account, and affects, well, inequalities, of course. For example, the occurrence of artificial intelligence that is now coming up. We haven't really thought about that yet. So for policymakers, there was also a lot of room to think about digital skills in relation to these developments.
I do indeed talk quite a lot to policymakers. And I therefore maybe also have a sympathy for what they're trying to do. And I think it's better that they're trying to do something and be informed using some of the models that are there, because there is a lot of work going on in that space as well, than if they would just kind of, base it on their intuitions or something. So I think using something that has been thought through and discussed and is part of the public domain and knowledge, and therefore kind of a bit more accountable, is a good thing. I think also, while they have flaws in terms of the individual ways in which certain things are measured, we can see that there's more and more kind of agreement on that we cannot just focus on these kind of technical skills, and we've seen examples of this today on like the really heavy emphasis on programming, something that's often taught in a very individual way, and an emphasis on these kind of skills as instrumental for jobs and things like that. So what we can see in the measurements, not always in the policy, but in the measurements that they're referring to, is that there's a much more nuanced understanding that actually to be able to be a full participant in a digital world, you need a variety of these skills, and that actually that's where we try to engage with policymakers when they use these data as maybe a little bit unthinkingly, is to say also, these skills are part of a broader environment, and we need to think about the future, as Alexander was saying, that you can have the skills that you want, but if the technologies are not designed in ways that reflect your reality, or that there's structural technical things that limit that, then all this individual skills training that you're doing, because that's often some of the conclusions that policymakers make, right? Okay, let's just give all the disadvantaged groups that are left behind digital literacy training, and then we can absolve any responsibility of what happens in the future. I think that's the kind of dialogue we should have with them on the basis of the data, and obviously try to improve the measurements of such, but I think more important is that when we see instances of people using this, to start again, also use it in the policy circles as a wider debate, as like, why might it be a problem when things are measured in a certain way or in a very narrow way? Or where are skills within the wider scope of a changing digital world, where maybe these functional skills are going to become less important because the technologies are going to, be intelligent and do things for you that you used to have these functional skills. So actually critical skills are becoming increasingly important. An understanding of why a technology presents a certain world to you, and maybe a different world to another person, this is going to be increasingly important. So rather than having technical discussions about the measurement, which yes, there's flaws and we can try to improve it, I think we need to kind of have broader discussions around how these measurements actually help us think through kind of, where we should invest public money, and maybe, yes, continue with the programming, but more and more we see that, this broader set of skills is going to be really important. And then if they want to know how to do it properly, they can come to us and, and ask.
Okay, maybe same question for the other two panelists, so both in terms of the policy approach to available data, but then also the kind of policies they could in place in response to some of the priorities needs you see from a digital skills point of view.
I want to add and to point out that there isn't like the policy or the recite, because there isn't the youth. There is, it's not just one big group, it's a very diverse group, and as we have also seen in the morning, the qualitative interviews, the use of digital media has a very different meaning, and for young people with mental health issues or with refugee experiences. So it's and we have, so I cannot really come up with like the policy now, but we have a thick report with a lot of recommendations, and but there is, so that's like one main point I want to make. There isn't like it's a very diverse group, as the whole population is, of course. And the second point was, I pass it on to you.
Thank you. Well, I have to mention that AI came to my mind when I thought about misinformation, because I think there you really need digital skills to evaluate whether ChatGPT is giving you a right answer or is it creating something that's not true, and which often is the case. I mean, especially if you use the cheap free versions of AI. But I think something important here is that this skills have been measured in many countries. It shows that they can be used cross-culturally. And I think that thinking of local policy, I think this should be used in all European countries. And to find the weak points in educational system where we would need more strengths, because those problems are probably local, that in different countries, different things are emphasized when kids are using, or if they are using digital skills at school, they should be using them, they need them in future. And I think that these certainly should be translated to all European languages very fast and to start to be used nationally, and then developing national educational programs.
Okay.
My second point was about that the digital skills by young people are learned a lot in informal learning processes, and as I said in the morning, that the parents in that kind of age group 12 to 17 years old, they don't want to, the parents are not like the right people to tell them what to do online, or not even, not only restrictive mediation isn't helpful, but also not enabling one. So, but regarding schools, it would be important to also not only have it in the curricula, but also have like workshops and projects, and where young people can develop and discuss digital skills.
Okay, good. So unless if there is a final burning question from the on-site audience, I will take this opportunity to close the panel on time. So I think we've come a long way from the methodological aspects to then looking at the more theoretical policy, practical implications. I think there's a warm invitation for policymakers to get more of these data in, but at the same time, I think I quite liked what Alan said in terms of also being empathetic and pragmatic, like it's also about having a meaningful exchange in terms of the kind of data which are available and looking for ways to push it further. And I think indeed a lot of the research coming out of this project can also help to make these kind of informed decisions. So I